The first shovel hit something that wasn't supposed to be there. Sarah froze. She looked down at the hole beneath her sunflowers. Then she looked toward her neighbor's property. He was standing at the fence. And when he saw what was in Sarah's hands, the color drained from his face. "Sarah," he shouted, "stop digging." But Sarah had already uncovered enough to know this wasn't an ordinary piece of farm equipment. It was metal. Old metal. And it was buried nearly 3 feet beneath the soil. The strangest part? Her neighbor had warned her about this exact spot before she ever planted the sunflowers. He had told her not to dig there. He wouldn't explain why. And now Sarah was beginning to understand that his warning hadn't been about the flowers. It had been about what was underneath them. It started several weeks earlier. Sarah had decided to expand one of her sunflower fields. The soil looked perfect. It received plenty of sunlight. The drainage was good. And after years of farming the property, she knew exactly where she wanted the new rows. There was only one problem. An older section of the field had never been planted. It was a strange rectangular patch of ground sitting between 2 productive areas. The previous owners had always left it alone. Sarah had never understood why. One afternoon, while she was checking the field, her neighbor, an older farmer named Tom, noticed her measuring the area. He walked over to the fence. "What are you planning to do there?" he asked. "Sunflowers," Sarah replied. Tom stared at the ground. Then he looked back at Sarah. "Don't dig there." Sarah laughed because she assumed he was joking. But Tom didn't smile. "I'm serious." "Why?" He hesitated. "Just leave that part alone." Sarah pressed him. Was the soil contaminated? Was there an old septic system? Was there buried electrical equipment? Tom wouldn't say. He simply repeated the same warning. "Whatever you do, don't start digging around in that section." Sarah eventually agreed, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. Because farmers don't normally leave good soil unused without a reason. A few days later, she noticed something else. The sunflowers she'd planted near the edge of the mysterious area were growing differently. They were taller, much taller. The leaves were unusually dark green, and several plants had developed thick stems that looked stronger than the rest of the field. Sarah initially thought she'd discovered an unusually fertile patch of soil. Then she noticed the pattern. The strongest sunflowers weren't scattered randomly. They formed an almost perfect line, a line that ran directly toward the untouched section. Sarah walked through the field. She examined the plants. She checked the soil. Nothing obvious explained it. She called Tom. "Why are these plants growing differently?" There was a long silence on the phone. Then Tom asked, "Did you dig?" "No." Another silence. "Good," he said, and hung up. That answer made Sarah even more suspicious. The following morning, Sarah walked back into the sunflower field. The plants were moving gently in the wind, but one particular sunflower caught her attention. It was leaning at an unusual angle. Sarah reached down to straighten it. That's when she saw something beneath the soil, a small piece of rusty metal. She brushed away the dirt. There was more. Sarah grabbed a shovel. She remembered Tom's warning. For a moment, she considered walking away, but curiosity won. She pushed the shovel into the ground. One scoop, then another. The soil was surprisingly loose. At about a foot deep, she hit something hard. Clang. Sarah stopped. She pushed the soil aside. Metal. Old metal. She continued digging carefully. The object became larger. It wasn't a pipe. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't modern farm equipment. It looked like the corner of a large metal container. Sarah stood up and called Tom. He didn't answer. She called again. Nothing. Then she heard a vehicle approaching. Tom's pickup stopped near the fence. He got out, and the moment he saw the hole, he shouted, "I told you not to dig!" Sarah stepped back. "What is this?" Tom didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the hole and stared into it. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Sarah asked, "What are you afraid I'm going to find?" Tom looked at her. "I don't know what's still down there." That sentence changed everything. Not, "There's nothing there." Not, "It's dangerous." He said he didn't know what was still down there. Sarah wanted an explanation. And this time, Tom gave her one. Decades earlier, before Sarah owned the farm, the property had been used differently. There had been an agricultural processing operation nearby. Farmers from the surrounding area brought crops there. Old machinery was stored on the property. And according to Tom, when the operation shut down, some equipment and materials were buried rather than removed. Sarah stared at the ground. "You knew." "I knew something was buried here." "What?" Tom shook his head. "I was a teenager. I didn't see everything." "Then why tell me not to dig?" Tom looked toward the field. "Because someone did it once." Sarah waited. Tom continued. "Years earlier, another farmer had tried to clear the area. He had brought in heavy machinery. The machine hit something underground. The farmer stopped. He dug around it. Then he covered the hole again. Nobody wanted to deal with what they had found." Sarah looked at the exposed metal. "So you think that's what it is?" Tom nodded. "Probably." Sarah wasn't satisfied. She called the county agricultural office and explained what they had discovered. They advised her not to disturb the area until it could be inspected. The next morning, an environmental specialist arrived. He examined the soil. Then he examined the metal. He didn't immediately touch it. Instead, he walked around the area, looking at the vegetation. Then he asked Sarah a strange question. "Have you noticed anything unusual about the sunflowers?" Sarah told him everything. The unusually tall plants, the dark green leaves, the line of growth. The specialist became more interested. He took soil samples from several locations, one from the sunflower field, one from the untouched area, and one from several feet away. The results came back 2 days later. The soil wasn't dangerously contaminated, but there were traces of old agricultural chemicals and petroleum-related compounds in the deeper soil. The specialist told Sarah they appeared to be historical, meaning they had probably been there for many years. That explained why Tom had been worried. But it didn't explain the metal. So Sarah made a decision. She wanted to know exactly what was underneath her field. With the proper specialists present, they carefully excavated the area. The hole became deeper, 3 feet, 4 feet, then 5, and finally the buried object began to reveal itself. It was an old underground storage tank, large, rusting, and almost completely forgotten. The specialist immediately became more cautious. They tested the surrounding soil. The tank had apparently been abandoned decades earlier. Fortunately, it wasn't full. But it had deteriorated badly. There were signs that small amounts of material had leaked into the surrounding soil over the years. Sarah stood beside the excavation and stared at it. This was what Tom had been afraid of. Not some mysterious curse. Not something supernatural. Something much more ordinary. And potentially much more dangerous. An old farm practice that had been forgotten. A buried tank. And chemicals that had been sitting underground longer than Sarah had been alive. But there was still one mystery. Why were the sunflowers growing so aggressively above that area? The specialist explained that the answer wasn't necessarily the contamination. The disturbed soil above the old tank had a different structure. Water moved differently through it. Nutrients had accumulated in certain areas, and the roots of the sunflowers were taking advantage of those conditions. The plants weren't detecting the tank. They were responding to changes in the soil. Sarah suddenly realized something. The sunflowers hadn't caused the discovery. They had revealed it. Their unusual growth pattern had given her the clue that something beneath the field was different. The old tank was eventually removed. The surrounding soil was carefully tested and treated. Sarah replanted the area after it was cleared. But she never forgot Tom's warning. A few weeks later, Sarah found him standing at the fence again. She walked over. "You knew something was down there." Tom nodded. "I suspected." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" He looked toward the field. "Because nobody wanted to open that chapter again." Sarah understood. Farm properties can carry decades of history. Old wells, buried pipes, abandoned tanks, collapsed structures. Things that made sense to people decades ago can become mysteries to the people who inherit the land later. And sometimes the clues are hiding in plain sight. A strange patch of grass, a line of unusually tall plants, a section nobody wants disturbed, a neighbor who suddenly becomes nervous when you mention digging. Sarah's sunflower field taught her something she never expected. The healthiest-looking plants aren't always telling you everything is fine. Sometimes they're telling you something underneath the soil has changed. And sometimes, the person telling you not to investigate isn't trying to keep a secret from you. They may simply know that some discoveries are easier to avoid than they are to explain. But Sarah also learned another lesson. If something doesn't make sense on your farm, don't automatically ignore it. Investigate safely. Ask questions. Test the soil. Find out what happened before you owned the land. Because the ground beneath your feet may have a history you know absolutely nothing about. And Sarah's story could have ended very differently if she had simply dug deeper without checking what she was dealing with. That rusty piece of metal wasn't just an old object. It was a warning from the past. And the sunflowers had helped her find it. Today, the field looks completely different. The sunflowers grow evenly. The soil has been restored. And there's no sign that anything was ever buried there. But every time Sarah walks past that field, she remembers the morning she put her shovel into the ground. She remembers the sound. Clang. She remembers looking down. And she remembers Tom standing at the fence, desperately telling her to stop. Because sometimes, the most interesting stories on a farm aren't growing above the soil. They're buried underneath it. And sometimes, the first person to warn you about what's underground is the last person you expect to know.